An old man in handcuffs walks into court. Moments later, the judge is on his feet in shock. It was a bitterly cold Monday morning, the kind where the chill seemed to settle deep in your bones, when the heavy double doors of the city courthouse creaked open. Heads turned as an old man entered, flanked by two uniformed officers. He didn't walk with fear or defiance, just quiet resignation. His posture was bent from age or weight of the world, no one could say for sure. Draped across his thin frame was a faded military-style coat, the kind once worn by soldiers who had seen more death than glory. It hung off his shoulders like a relic, the color dulled by time, but still adorned with military pins and service ribbons that clung stubbornly to the fabric, as if unwilling to let history forget him. His face was lean and sharp, with sunken cheeks, a strong jaw barely hidden under grizzled stubble, and deep-set eyes that held no fear, no shame, just a tired kind of silence. Handcuffs bit lightly into his wrists, but he made no protest as the officers guided him forward. The clang of his boots echoed through the courtroom hall with eerie rhythm, each step measured, deliberate, as though he had long accepted his fate. Murmurs spread like ripples through the crowd gathered inside. Some leaned in to whisper, others pulled out their phones to record, because nothing sparked curiosity more than the sight of an old man in shackles. To them, he was just another homeless man, some vagrant probably caught loitering where he didn't belong, a forgotten soul dragged into the spotlight for the brief amusement of the public eye. His coat was dirty, stained from sleeping rough, his nails yellowed, his hands trembling ever so slightly, but what caught the eye of a few observant onlookers were those medals on his chest. Bronze, silver, and even a few that appeared to be foreign in design, symbols of past valor that seemed oddly out of place on a man whose shoes were splitting at the soles and who hadn't known a hot shower in weeks. But curiosity gave way to judgment as the whispers sharpened. "Must have stolen that coat from a veteran," someone scoffed. "Bet he wears those medals to scam for money." The comments stung the air like needles, but the man didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to hear them. Perhaps he was used to it, the quick assumptions, the easy contempt, the way people loved a good hero story until the hero was standing right in front of them, broken and unrecognizable. The officers guiding him exchanged a glance but said nothing. Their grip on his arms was firm but not cruel. Maybe even a little hesitant, like they knew there was something different about this one. But policy was policy, and trespassing on federal grounds, even if the man hadn't resisted, hadn't spoken a word when he was found sitting quietly in a restricted hallway of the National Archives building, was still a federal offense. As they approached the bench, the judge, still scanning over paperwork from a previous case, barely looked up. His clerk whispered something in his ear, and the judge gave the old man a quick glance, bored, disinterested, the way one might glance at a jaywalker or a petty thief. He tapped the gavel once and signaled for the proceedings to begin. Still, the old man said nothing. He simply stood there, looking forward, eyes locked on some distant memory no one else could see. A slight cough escaped his throat, dry and hollow, but he straightened his back as best he could, as if determined to retain whatever dignity he had left. A young public defender, flipping through the case file, seemed caught between embarrassment and confusion. Caught sleeping inside the National Archives building, she began, her voice barely above a mumble. Claims he entered through an unsecured loading bay. No damage, no theft, no violence. Just sat there. She paused and looked over at him. Didn't speak. Just sat in front of a wall exhibit. A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow, vaguely intrigued now. But still, the old man said nothing. The officers released their grip and stepped back. And for a moment, it felt like the world had paused. Not because anyone knew who he was, not yet. But because something about his presence, his stillness, the quiet strength beneath the frailty, seemed out of place in this sterile courtroom filled with cynicism and red tape. And then, for the first time, the old man raised his eyes and glanced around the courtroom. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, scanning every face like he was searching for something, or someone. People instinctively looked away. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was shame. Or maybe it was the sudden, uncomfortable realization that this wasn't just a random man in chains. This was someone who had lived. Someone who had seen things that most of them never would. And now he stood before them, judged not for his past, but for the circumstances that had erased it from memory. The prosecutor cleared his throat to speak, but the old man's gaze stopped on the judge, and the judge stopped mid-breath as their eyes locked. The silence grew heavier. The room shifted. No one knew what was about to unfold. Not yet, but something about that name, that face, that presence, it would change everything. The courtroom sat in stiff silence as the judge, still distracted with paperwork, finally looked up. "State your name for the record," he said flatly, his voice carrying the same indifference he used for dozens of petty cases each day. The old man, still standing tall despite his hunched frame, slowly turned his eyes toward the bench. With a voice roughened by time, "Where, and maybe war," he replied, "Leonard Graves." The name seemed to hang in the air, untouched by time or recognition, at first. But then something shifted. A stillness, deeper than silence, settled over the room. The judge's pen froze mid-stroke. His eyes narrowed, then widened as he stared at the old man. "What did you just say?" the judge asked, his tone no longer routine, but stunned. "Leonard Graves," the man repeated, firmer this time, as though daring the world to remember him. The judge rose slowly from his seat, his fingers trembling just enough for his wedding ring to catch the light. "Sergeant Major Leonard Graves?" he asked again, barely above a whisper, though everyone in the room heard it. Now the energy in the courtroom cracked like a lightning bolt. Every head turned, the murmurs silenced not by command but by awe. The air felt different, charged. One of the bailiffs blinked in disbelief, his hand resting on his holstered weapon not from fear, but from confusion. A few older veterans in the back row, men who'd been sitting quietly through the morning docket, suddenly stood. One even saluted. The judge, pale and visibly shaken, stepped down from the bench. "You saved my brother," he said quietly, walking slowly toward the man. "Operation Stone Halo. You led the rescue unit. They said you died overseas." A flicker of pain and memory crossed Leonard's face. "I did," he said softly. "Just not the way they expected." The judge stood still, tears forming behind his glasses. He wasn't just a judge anymore. In that moment, he was a younger brother looking at the man who had saved his family. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom, it was a time capsule, cracked open, releasing a flood of recognition, regret, and reverence. Reporters lowered their cameras. No one dared speak. For a moment, the old man was not a trespasser, not a homeless criminal, not a forgotten relic, he was a legend standing in chains. The judge turned to the clerk and said, "Strike all charges. Release him immediately." His voice trembled, but the authority in it was undeniable. This man is not a threat. He is a hero. The shackles came off. Leonard didn't thank them. He didn't need to. He just stood still, his dignity finally returned, his silence no longer mistaken for weakness but honored as strength. In that courtroom, justice wasn't served through law, it was served through memory. The buzz outside the courtroom was deafening as word spread like wildfire through the courthouse hallways and beyond. Leonard Graves, the name that had once echoed through classified military briefings and whispered war stories, had just been spoken aloud after decades of silence. Inside, the judge returned to his bench, visibly shaken, his voice softer now, reverent. "I thought you were dead," he said again, echoing the disbelief that hung thick in the air. Leonard looked at him, not with pride, not with bitterness, but with the weary calm of a man who had lived far too many lives for one lifetime. "I was supposed to be," he said quietly, his voice scratchy but steady. The story that followed wasn't one anyone in the courtroom had expected to hear. Sergeant Major Leonard Graves had led Operation Stone Halo, a classified military rescue mission during a brutal conflict overseas. The mission was considered impossible, his unit was outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered. But under his command, over 400 soldiers were extracted safely. Graves had stayed behind to cover the final retreat. He was declared missing in action, presumed dead after weeks of failed searches. A posthumous award was drafted. A funeral held. But Leonard didn't die. Wounded, captured, and eventually released in a foreign prisoner exchange that was kept secret for diplomatic reasons, he returned home under a sealed identity. "They told me I had a choice," he said, his eyes fixed not on the judge but on the floor, on something far beyond the room. "A medal and a grave, or freedom without a name. I chose to live quietly. I had nothing left but a promise I'd made to a man in my unit, to look after his boy if I ever got out." Leonard had returned to a country that didn't know he was alive, to a home that no longer remembered his face. His wife had remarried, believing him lost. His son, too young to recall his father's features, had grown up thinking he was an orphan. And Leonard, true to his promise, watched from a distance, never intervening, never asking for anything. He worked odd jobs, lived in shelters, drifted from place to place, always avoiding questions, always moving quietly through the cracks of society. "I wasn't homeless because I had no home," he said. "I was homeless because I no longer had a place in the world." His words struck the courtroom like thunder. The people who had once mocked his appearance now sat frozen, eyes wet, as the man they thought was a vagrant revealed himself to be a ghost of their nation's forgotten sacrifice. And through it all, Leonard didn't boast. He didn't dramatize. He told his story like a man recounting someone else's life, distant, detached, yet unshakably real. This wasn't a story about war. It was a story about what happens after war. About the quiet suffering of men whose heroism becomes too inconvenient to remember. And for the first time, the silence in the courtroom wasn't judgment. It was mourning, for all the stories like his that had never been told. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of judgment, it felt like a sanctuary. A sacred space where the past had returned to demand acknowledgement. Judge Foster, still standing, removed his glasses, wiped the corners of his eyes, and looked at Leonard with something far greater than respect. It was reverence. "This courtroom has no authority over the life you've lived," he said quietly. "But today, we do have the power to make one thing right." With a calm but resolute tone, he declared all charges dismissed. Sergeant Major Leonard Graves is free to go. No, he should never have been brought in at all. The gavel struck the desk softly, like a salute rather than a verdict. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling like a rising tide. Reporters lowered their cameras, no longer documenting a scandal, but a resurrection. Veterans in the gallery stood, some saluting, others simply crying. Even the bailiffs who had walked Leonard in chains now stood by silently, their faces lowered in shame. Leonard didn't react with celebration. He just nodded slightly, as if acknowledging an overdue moment, not a gift. He turned to leave, his steps still slow, but somehow taller than before. He walked out of the courtroom as quietly as he had entered, but this time, the silence followed him not from doubt, but from awe. In that room, justice had been served, but not by law. It had been served by truth, by memory, by finally hearing a voice that had been silent for too long. Leonard Graves vanished into the crowd that day, but not into obscurity. His name was no longer forgotten. It was remembered, etched into every heart present, a living echo of a nation's debt finally, if only slightly, repaid.